Hey, welcome along to another video edition of Mark's Mailbox. We did one of our live audio Q&As, whatever they call it, live stream, whatever it's called, the other day. And we didn't get to all the questions I got, so we put some of them aside. I'm going to do them today. The first one comes from Ray Bolland, and Ray writes, "Hi Mark, living in Malaysia, I can't join in on the live Q&As, but I wonder what your thoughts are on these two questions. Does Trump have any friends, allies with any power in the White House and or DC? If so, is there any hope the swamp can be drained, or will it eventually subsume or defenestrate him? Proud to be a founding member of the Mark Steyn Club. Keep fighting all your good fights." Thank you for that, Ray, and I'm sorry what with the time zones, I think our live stream audio Q&A is about 4 a.m. in Malaysia, so it is hard for you to participate live, but we are always glad to hear from our Malay members of the club. And you ask about whether Trump has any friends or allies with any power in the White House and or DC, or is the swamp just going eventually to consume him? The swamp is fighting a very fierce battle on multiple fronts. And they're doing this several ways. One is that the permanent bureaucracy is actually leaking against him, quite disgracefully. When, for example, they're leaking private conversations with the Australian Prime Minister or the Mexican President, you'd think those conversations were quite tightly held, but nothing is tightly held. The American bureaucracy is so vast. There's over 4 million people with top security clearance. That's about the population. That's like, imagine if everybody in New Zealand was a member of MI6. You know, there's a reason why James Bond is 007, licensed to kill. There's meant to be very few of them. The minute you have top secret agents and it's 4,000,007, the whole thing goes to pieces. So you've got the permanent bureaucracy leaking against him. You've got the Democrats who are just itching to impeach him. And you've got the Republican Party, which wants to basically castrate him and make him a conventional Republican president. In other words, yes, he's Trump and he'll say Trumpish things and he'll tweet all the time, but essentially he'll govern as Jeb Bush or John Kasich would have. And that's the dangerous one, I think, the idea of castrating him and turning him into Jeb Bush or John Kasich. And they're getting pretty close to him in certain respects in that people they've been able to take out around him. And I don't know where this goes, but I think Trump will succeed or fail as Trump on the issues that got Trump elected, such as the forgotten man and immigration and the return of some kind of manufacturing and meaningful purpose to life. And it's not going to work trying to turn him into Jeb Bush or John Kasich. That's the most threatening one to him, I would say. And we're always glad, as I said, to hear from our club members in Kuala Lumpur or any other part of Malaysia. I was thinking the other day, because if you're an old school imperialist like me, the first generation of independent leaders are very vivid. They were kind of vivid part of my childhood, and I don't suppose many Americans have heard of Tunku Abdul Rahman, but the Tunku was a very vivid figure in the early days after he was Malaya's first prime minister and then Malaysia's first prime minister, and he famously landed at Heathrow Airport at the height of the Profumo sex scandal when Her Majesty's, Her Britannic Majesty's Minister for War had been having an affair with the same lady of ill repute as the leading Soviet KGB man at the Soviet embassy in London. And the Profumo sex scandal wound up bringing down the Conservative government eventually. And there was a rather delightful lady whom I knew in later life a little bit. I knew there were two girls, Christine Keeler and Mandy Rice Davis. And Christine Keeler, who had a sort of a very vulnerable kind of beauty, and then Mandy Rice Davis, who was the bubbly one and gave all the best sound bites. And Tunku Abdul Rahman from Malaysia landed at Heathrow Airport. And some reporter asked what he wanted, and he said, "I want Mandy." And Mandy is a Malaysian term for a bath, which is the sort of thing you'd say if you'd been on a long flight from Kuala Lumpur to Heathrow. But in fact, they took it that he actually wanted Mandy Rice Davis. So he delighted Fleet Street. But in fact, he wanted a bath after a long flight. I've gotten off track here. What I meant to say was about the Tunku. Tunku Abdul Rahman said to Sir Garfield Barwick, who was External Affairs Minister of Australia and later the longest-serving Chief Justice in Australian history. And the Tunku said to Sir Garfield that there's nothing more insoluble than diversity. And he was recommending to Sir Garfield that Australia remain a white European nation, because he said the problem of diversity is insoluble. And he said, in Malaysia, I have Malays, I have Indians, I have Chinese, and the problem of diversity is insoluble. And I thought about that the other day in relation to some of the chaos and tribalism we see of identity politics playing out on the streets and at college campuses and elsewhere. Thomas Ryan writes, the Taliban destroyed centuries-old sculptures in Afghanistan some years ago. I believe it was Aleppo where ancient religious landmarks were destroyed by ISIS. What we are seeing in the USA is no different. History is being destroyed, and if one doesn't know the past, one is destined to repeat it. And you're right that is what is going on, that the Antifa movement are basically, when they want to get rid of these statues of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, they are like the Taliban and ISIS. It wasn't Aleppo, incidentally, it was Palmyra, which is spectacular ruins of an ancient civilization. But ISIS destroy them, and the Taliban destroy the Buddhas, so that by eliminating the past, you eliminate the past's influence on the future. That's why people destroy the past. And if you look at Islamic groups like ISIS and the Taliban, they destroy the past to eliminate any alternative view to theirs. In other words, you destroy those Buddhas, you destroy Palmyra, you destroy, as they do around Timbuktu and elsewhere in that part of the world, in the Maghreb, in North Africa, in the Middle East, out to the Hindu Kush. You destroy any signs of pre-Islamic civilization, and you make until Islam is king on a field of corpses. That's all there is. And that's exactly what we see when people who, 150 years after these statues to Robert E. Lee went up, or Jefferson Davis, decide that it is an affront to them to have a statue of Robert E. Lee. You should be very wary when anybody is determined to demolish the past. Joe writes, slavery is still rampant in Muslim countries throughout the Middle East and Africa, yet these safe space fascists can't give themselves enough merit badges for virtue signalling by attacking figurines and statues. That's true. That's true. And it won't stop with these ones, because they will move on. I think it's 46 of the 51 signers of the Declaration of Independence were slaveholders. And they're not doing it because they're particularly interested in the Civil War or in slavery. They're doing it to demolish and weaken and ultimately hollow out the very idea of America. So they're saying that because the men who signed the Declaration of Independence are slaveholders, then the Declaration itself is illegitimate. I find this fascinating for one reason. When I watch these social justice warriors demolishing statues all over the South, they're saying that monuments to figures from the Confederate States of America cannot be permitted to retain their presence on the main streets of American cities. The biggest slavery supporting institution, and I say this as a non-American, but the biggest slavery supporting institution on the planet in the 19th century was the American Democrat Party. The American Democrats, the biggest slavery supporting institution on the planet, and the only one that has survived to the present day. I mean, it's fascinating to me if you look at the National Party in South Africa, or Ian Smith's party in Rhodesia, they're gone, vanished. They were forced to change their names and renounce the past and turn themselves into something else. But the Democrat Party endures. It's absolutely phenomenal to me that an institution that throughout the 19th century was the biggest defender of slavery, the overwhelming supporter of the Ku Klux Klan, is still around. And I don't quite understand the rampaging snowflakes in the street. You know, we can't have statues of Confederate soldiers, any old Confederate soldier, just there to represent an ordinary private who fought for his state in the Civil War. That can't be allowed to stand. Robert E. Lee can't be allowed to stand. Slaveholding Thomas Jefferson can't be allowed to stand. But the Democrat Party, the biggest slave-supporting institution on the planet, endures. So I'll take these guys seriously when they go to Democrat headquarters and tear that joint down. Paul Harmon says you can't organize a stable, healthy, happy society around tribes. The USA has been successful all these years because of the Christian-based constitution and civil society. It has become a tribal society via the work of the KKK, affirmative action, and through the encouragement of the leftists or communists among us to get ours from the government. Can't we learn from the Hutus and the Tutsis, from the French and the Germans, from the Serbs and the Albanians, from the Irish and the English, from the Japanese and the Koreans, from the Mongols and the Han, from the Kurds and the Turks? Christ gave us the only basis for a free and happy nation. Living for him rather than living for our tribe is the only good route forward. Well, you're confusing, I think, certain things there, Paul. I don't like tribalistic societies. And I don't care whether the tribes are black and white, or they're gay and straight, or they're Muslim and infidel, or they're transgendered and cisgendered. The minute your politics becomes tribal, it's very problematic. The French and the Germans, the Irish and the English, that kind of thing, that's only a problem if they're confined within the same polity. So if you're going to have a tribe, if the French are a tribe, then you give them a nation, and then they think as Frenchmen, and you'll have French conservatives and French socialists. You'll have right-wing French and left-wing French. The Irish and the English, if you look in the 19th century Ireland until, I think it was the 1852 election, they voted as liberals and conservatives, just as the Scots did, the English did, the Welsh did. And then in the 1850s, you saw the rise of the Irish Parliamentary Party, which is a kind of tribal politics. And we now have in Scotland the Scottish nationalists, and in Wales the Welsh nationalists, and in Northern Ireland I think they've got 23 different political parties represented at various levels of government, representing different proliferations and strains of unionism and nationalism. So at a certain point, once you no longer, in other words, the crude point I'm making is once the Irish in the mid-19th century ceased to think as liberals or conservatives and began voting as Irishmen, then in a sense they made their continuation in the United Kingdom impossible. So the point is always to find an organising basis for your state that is generally reflective of the people in that state. Now, to go back to Tunku Abdul Rahman's point, if you've got that, why monkey with it? In other words, if you've got the United States, a unilingual English-speaking society, and you look at Canada, for example, where the fact that they're not all English-speaking has made that society less cohesive, to the point where just 20 years ago, a majority of Quebec francophones voted to secede from Canada. They didn't want to be in the same society as Quebec Anglophones. They didn't want to be in the same society as Canadian Anglophones. Again, the differences between these people are minimal. The differences between Northern Irish Catholics and Northern Irish Protestants are minimal in the scheme of things. Yet they can't agree on the country they're in. When you've done that, then, when you've seen that, why would you suddenly import huge numbers of Spanish-speaking peoples and turn yourself into a semi-bilingual society, as much of America has become? If you were in Europe, and you understand the differences between Irish Catholics and Irish Protestants, why would you then think, oh, well, that's an insoluble, intractable problem, but we can import large numbers of Muslims and that won't be a problem? And again, Tunku Abdul Rahman's words about the insolubility of diversity are worth bearing in mind. Ken Watkins writes, one of the things that drives me crazy is the fact that the mainstream media could be silenced or at least slowed if all conservative viewers simply cut the cord and refused to watch any shows, whether it be for news or for entertainment. I can't believe that someone hasn't tried to organise this revolt. What am I missing? P.S. I cut the cable about 4 years ago and have never looked back. Ken, you can do that with news because you can find alternative sources of news. But it's asking a lot to expect half the country to give up entertainment. And this is where the problem is for the right. Culture trumps politics. Culture trumps politics every time. And I look at, for example, the $1 billion that Mitt Romney spent in 2012. It was all completely wasted. You might as well have tossed it into the Potomac and watched it float out to sea. That $1 billion would have been much better invested in seed money to buy a TV network, to launch a sitcom, to make a big hit movie. The problem, you say, refuse to watch any shows, whether it be for news or for entertainment. It's easy to give up Dan Rather, Peter Jennings, Tom Brokaw. I don't think any of them are doing their shows anymore, but that's how long it is since I watched any of those guys. It's easy to give those guys up. It's less easy to say you've also got to give up whatever the hot new sitcoms and dramas and all the rest of them are. And the right has abandoned too much of that turf. And that has caused a lot of the problems there. And you need to get back to playing on all those fields. James Patey writes, I'm a UK subscriber to the Mark Steyn Club, currently in France on holiday. Any thoughts on Macron and his drop in popularity? Monsieur Macron is the new president of France, Emmanuel Macron, and he has his very charming lady wife that I think Trump said you've got a, what did he say to her? You're in fabulous shape or whatever, because she's like 25, 37, 43 years older than Monsieur Macron. He's like this boy president with this sophisticated older woman. It's a very Gallic kind of fantasy. Monsieur Macron's numbers have dived because he ran as something he wasn't. He ran as an outsider. All the establishment parties, nobody wanted them. The socialist parties, the mainstream left of centre, right of centre parties, nobody wanted them. They were discredited. The only alternative to them was Marine Le Pen. and Marine Le Pen terrified a lot of the French establishment. So the French establishment essentially found itself an insider who could pretend to run like an outsider. And that's what they did with Monsieur Macron. And it worked very successfully, and he's now the president of France. But he's not an outsider, and he's not going to change anything. And his numbers are headed south because the French state is unsustainable. So the question is whether they decide to take a flyer on Marine Le Pen or whoever succeeds her next time, or whether by the time they get around to voting for a genuine outsider, it will be too late. Laura Rosen Cohen, one of my compatriots from the Dominion of Canada, writes, does Germany actually deserve to live? Are we getting to the Mark Steyn too stupid to survive point yet? Is there one for Germany? This is a story from the Daily Mail she links to. The stand-up urinal for women. Berlin is now introducing urinals for women. Because women, as you know, if you've ever sat at a sidewalk cafe and watched the women come strolling by. Women wear the pants in Germany, so now they get to use urinals too. This is a fascinating story. The gender-neutral urinals are now being... I believe they've got them in Switzerland too. I can't remember where, but I was in a little bit of Switzerland a year ago, and they had some urinals for women too. What's interesting to me here is that about 10 years ago, the big thing in Germany was what they call Sitzpinklers. That's for men. They were making men sit down to urinate, and they called them the Sitzpinklers. That's what they called. And they had, I think it was the voice of Gerhard Schroeder, who if you walked into a public toilet and tried to stand up to relieve yourself, the voice of Gerhard Schroeder said, "Hey, no standing up to pee. Here we're all Sitzpinklers, jawohl." And it would have been better if they'd actually got Hitler. They could have got some hologram of Hitler to come in the cubicle with you and make sure you're sitting down to relieve yourself. So they were trying to turn German men into a generation of Sitzpinklers. And now, I don't know what happened to that, but the Sitzpinklers were everywhere. And now they've decided if the men are going to be the Sitzpinklers and sit down to urinate, and the women are going to stand up to urinate. This is too obvious a metaphor for the decline of the Western world in the last half century. It is too obvious. If you put it in a novel or a movie, people would say this is like too crass. It's too obvious a metaphor. But that's how it is. In Germany, the men are all Sitzpinklers and the women stand up to relieve themselves. A point to bear in mind. They're coming for us all. And as the voice in the German public toilet says, "Hey you, Sitzpinkling or else." No Sitzpinkling here. We will see you next time.